Today I'm reading The Little Brown Bear by Elizabeth Upham. Little Brown Bear. And the first story is called The Little Brown Bear Loses His Clothes. Halfway up Blueberry Hill, a funny old yellow house lived Little Brown Bear. Little Brown Bear liked to hunt for honey. He liked to sit on the steps of the old yellow house, and he liked to lie in the hammock under the mulberry tree, but he didn't like to hang up his clothes when he went to bed. Every night when Little Brown Bear was ready to go to bed, plop, down on the floor went his nice red coat, his new checkered shirt, and his handsome gray trousers, and plop, into one corner went his polka dot silk tie, and onto the chair went his straw hat. Poof, out went the candle. Whisk, under the covers went Little Brown Bear. One night, round Mr. Moon looked down through the window into Little Brown Bear's room and called out loudly, "Such an untidy room for a good little bear." Coat on the floor, hat on the chair. But Little Brown Bear turned over in bed and pulled the covers around his ears, pretending he hadn't heard a word that round Mr. Moon had been saying. Soon Mr. Owl looked through the window and called out very loudly, "To-whit, to-hoo, to-whit, to-hoo, such a careless thing for a bear to do." Little Brown Bear just turned over in bed and pulled the covers high over his ears and pretended he hadn't heard a word old Mr. Owl had been saying. By and by, Mr. Wind came whistling around and round the old yellow house. He called through the window very, very loudly, "Little Brown Bear, don't wait, hang up your clothes before it's too late." But that foolish bear only turned over in bed and pulled the cover still higher over his ears and pretended he hadn't heard a word that Mr. Wind had been saying. Then, woof, Mr. Wind blew right through the window and whisked up Little Brown Bear's nice coat, his new checkered shirt, his handsome little gray trousers. Then, whoop, he blew again, and away went Little Brown Bear's polka dot silk tie, and his little straw hat. The next morning, Little Brown Bear jumped right out of bed bright and early. He was going to take his shiny pail and go into the woods after blueberries, but he couldn't find his clothes. He looked for them everywhere. He looked upstairs and downstairs. He looked in every corner under the furniture, but he could not find them. So Little Brown Bear put on last year's old patch overalls and sat down on the steps of the yellow house and cried and cried. By and by, he heard Mrs. Duck calling out as she hurried down the hill, "You're all invited to come to tea down at my garden at 3:30. That made Little Brown Bear feel very bad indeed, and he cried and cried harder and harder, for of course he couldn't go to Mrs. Duck's tea party in last year's old patched overalls. He just sat there in the sun, thinking and crying and crying, and thinking and thinking and crying. Suddenly, out of all that thinking, a thought popped into Little Brown Bear's head. He wiped his eyes on his old last year's bandana and jumped up. "I know what I'll do," he said to himself. "Even if I can't go to the tea party myself, I'll make Mrs. Duck a pail of nice fresh mulberries for her tea party. I can hurry home before anyone sees that I'm not dressed up." So Little Brown Bear ran over to the mulberry tree and began to shake it very hard. And what do you suppose happened? Right out of that mulberry tree, something went plop and fell down at Little Brown Bear's. And down fell Little Brown Bear's nice red coat, his new checkered shirt, and his handsome little gray trousers, and his polka dot silk tie, and his little straw hat. For that was where Mr. Wind had hidden them after he had whisked them away the night before. So Little Brown Bear went right to Mrs. Duck's tea party after all. And that night, Mr. Moon looked in through Little Brown Bear's window and smiled. He smiled and smiled. Then old Mr. Owl looked through the window and smiled. He smiled and smiled and smiled. And by Mr. Wind looked through the window and smiled. He smiled and smiled and smiled. Coat and hat and tie hung up with care. What a tidy little room for a little brown bear, he chuckled softly to himself. The end.